Hello and good evening. Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. On behalf of the Center for Criminal Justice, my name is Professor Alexis Hogue-Forjour, and I'm the co-director along with Kate Mogilescu and Professor Jocelyn Simonson. We are thrilled to have you here at the first in-person public-facing CCJ event. Woo. I want to thank all the folks in the room and who aren't in the room that made tonight possible. We have BLS's in-house communications department, Chris Gibbons, the IT folks, catering. Thank you for helping. Stay tuned for CCJ events in the spring. One of our current initiatives is happening with our 6 fellows who are upper level students. They have partnered with people, system survivors, to bring in the voices of directly impacted people into the first year crim law classroom. So we're super excited about that. It's the first time that we've done that. Professor Jocelyn Simonson has led that effort along with our fellows. We have a reception to follow upstairs with food and wine and other beverages, so please stay tuned. But I am thrilled and so excited to turn it over to Professor Mogilescu to introduce Hugh Ryan.
Thank you. What a beautiful group of people. My goodness. It's so nice to see so many current Brooklyn Law students, former students, former colleagues, current colleagues, everyone here. Thank you all for coming tonight. I'm thrilled to get to introduce Hugh Ryan and be in conversation with Hugh tonight about his new book. Hugh said, please don't read a long bio about me, so I'm going to try to distill it to its most critical. But Hugh is a historian. He's a writer, a curator, and his work really looks at queer politics, culture, and history in New York City, both in this book that we will be talking about tonight, The Women's House of Detention, and also in his earlier book, When Brooklyn Was Queer. We are just ecstatic. This book has already gotten some acclaim. You might have heard Hugh on NPR or in various other outlets talking about his work researching and leading up to this book. So we're just gonna dig right in. What we think we'll do, if it's all right, well, actually it's all right, I say it's all right and I'm moderating. We'll talk for a little while. We wanna make sure to open it up to questions as well in the audience. We have some of our fellows in the back with microphones when we get to that time. But let's start, if we can.
Yeah.
The book is called The Women's House of Detention. And this is a jail that existed in Manhattan through much of the 20th century. And a place that, and this is a quote that you include in the book, that Audre Lorde describes was right smack in the middle of the village and always felt like one up for our side. A defiant pocket of female resistance, ever present as a reminder of possibility as well as punishment. Can we start by just kind of learning a little bit about what the House of Detention was?
Sure. So the House of D, who here is familiar with Greenwich Village at all? Come on, show your hands. Yeah. Okay, you know the Jefferson Market Library. It's that courthouse with the big clock, 6th Avenue, Christopher Street, 10th. That was once a courthouse, right? That was the night court and the women's court. And the little garden that was next to it, that was a 12-story maximum security women's prison and jail called the Women's House of Detention. That actually wasn't the first detention center on that space. It was built in 1929 and it was torn down in 1974. Before that, there was the Jefferson Market jail complex. Before that, there was a police detention center. There have been detention centers in that space since the mid-1800s, and in Greenwich Village since basically right around the time the US was founded. The 1790s, the first prison opens up in Greenwich Village. So prisons, detention centers, policing have been central to the story of Greenwich Village since the start of the village, since before the village was part of New York City. The House of D was merely the last of them. I say it was both a jail and prison. It was originally intended only to be a jail. The reason it was built there was that the women's court was already next door. And the idea was that this would be a place for women to be held while they were on trial, or if they were a material witness, or in some other way not yet sentenced but court involved. However, it was started in 1929. The day they laid the stone for the prison, the first stone, was also the day the stock market crashed. And in that moment, they had already been pushing, the wardens of the other prisons in New York City had been pushing for this to not be just a jail, but to be a jail and prison combined, and for what was intended as a large hospital to serve indigent and court-involved women, trans folks, non-binary folks, so they did not have that language and did not consider those people, but that was largely who the prison was serving. That hospital was removed from the plans during construction, so we get a very small hospital, a single floor, and 10 stories of a jail and prison, originally built to hold 400. It often held 5, 6, sometimes almost as many as 800 people at a time. So that's kind of the basic overview of what the place was and when it existed.
So what led you, though, as a historian, to look at this institution?
It's funny, you know, all of my work kind of comes from the same place, which is pure ignorance. I am not a historian by training. I am a women's studies major in undergrad, and I have a master's in creative nonfiction. But I come from many generations of New Yorkers. I grew up right outside the city. I have lived here. I have studied queer history and New York City history for decades. And when I find something that feels like it should be in my wheelhouse, but I actually don't know anything about it, like the queer history of Brooklyn with my first book, I find myself drawn to dig into those places and see, why don't I know something? What am I missing? What have I not been taught or not been listening to the people who are trying to share this information? And if I find that I'm not the only one who seems to not know something critical, that's when I know that it's a project for me to take on. With this book, I had already been thinking about the House of D because of my previous book. Some of the folks that I profile in it passed through the House of Detention or the Women's Court or other connected institutions like the Hudson Girls Training School or Bedford Hills. So there were people like Mabel Hampton, who's a black lesbian dancer and domestic worker whose oral histories were kept by the Lesbian Herstory Archives, which she helped found. She passed through the Women's Court, and she's essential to my first book. So I was sort of following her thread. And then there was a trans man named Big Cliff Trondle, who was actually arrested not very far from here at all in 1913 for wearing pants. And smoking cigarettes, and he was sent there as well. All of these folks that in my first book kind of led me to think about the House of D. But I wasn't really certain that it was something that I was going to take on. It felt like it was connected to my work, but I wasn't sure yet. And then maybe about 6 years ago, I took a tour of the West Village with Jay Toole, an incredible activist who's done a ton of work around formerly incarcerated and shelter-involved folks here in New York City, who also leads these tours of the West Village to talk about the House of Detention and its queer history, because as she said to me, that world is being forgotten right now. So I had my previous work that sort of led me there, and then I had an elder in my own community looking me directly in the face and saying, I am being forgotten. My history is being erased. So that said to me, okay, I've got this background, I have this current moment. Now what's the size and scope, right? Is this a book? Is this an article? And I started to do some research. And one of the things I very quickly hit on was a report done by the Williams Institute out of UCLA, which said that 40% of people currently incarcerated in women's prisons, 40% are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or trans. And that figure, actually, when more I dug into it, it holds true in detention centers for youth as well. Detention centers intended for girls, 40% of those incarcerated in them identify as queer. 40%. It is a crisis of incarceration that is almost never talked about by mainstream queer organizations. And that's when I really decided that this was going to be my next project, right? It connected to the work I was already doing. It felt like my community was speaking directly to me and saying that this was work needed to be done and that I was poised to do. And the scope of it was so large, and I knew so little, right? I wanted to correct my own ignorance, and in the process, maybe hopefully share some information with other people.
So talking about the scope of the project, I mean, you work through several periods of history in the book, even predating the House of D with the institutions that came before and kind of going through each era. But you do it through telling people's stories. I mean, you just mentioned Jay Toole, you mentioned Mabel Hampton. How did you connect to those stories, and what was the sort of research and archiving? process for you?
It's funny, the entire first year of writing this book was simply doing the research to see if I could tell the stories in the right way, because jails produce a ton of information, and it's usually pretty bad, right? It's poorly taken, it's poorly preserved, it's really biased, and it sees everything, and particularly queer folks, through the lens of criminality, because it's established as a way of keeping records of problems that we're solving, right? So everything it looks at is a problem. So I knew I couldn't tell this story just from the jail records, even if I could get access to them, because trying to get access to jail records will drive you absolutely nuts, right? But all of that aside, I knew I couldn't tell the story with just those records. So I started off with the things that had been helpful for my last book. I looked through queer periodicals, particularly the ones going back into the 50s and 60s, found very little there. Mentions of criminality, yes, but only around specifically gay crimes, particularly men arrested for soliciting and drag kings and queens arrested for cross-dressing. That was really all I came across. I tried next looking at the historical collections of famous LGBTQ New Yorkers, thinking that in their private papers or their correspondence they might have talked about it. There's a little bit there, but not much. The organizations that kind of come up in New York City, like the Radical Lesbians and the Gay Liberation Front, all come about around 1968, 67, 69, 70, 71, the very end period of the prison. So while their stuff had a little bit about the end time of the prison, it didn't have the formulative stuff, it didn't have the early years, and again, it was rarely told from the perspective of people who had actually been incarcerated, which is the way that this story needed to be told. So I thought for a moment that I actually was not going to be able to write this book. I thought, ugh, this is not going to happen. And I said I needed to think about how other historians who do this work, who work in marginalized histories, how they find these records. And particularly useful was the work of Saadia Hartman, who wrote Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, which is an incredible book I highly recommend everyone read. And she uses what she calls critical fabulation, which is thinking into and imagining into the lives of subjects for whom the archive does not exist, right? And I didn't want to quite do that. I felt that that's not quite my practice. But that practice of using my imagination to think about the lives of the people I wanted to write about could actually be very helpful as a researcher, because there are two ways that we end up in the historical record, right? Either you have power, in which case you write a book so your ideas are out in the world, and then people interview you so you're in newspapers, and then you have money so you establish a scholarship at a college which preserves your name, you own your own home, your children keep your documents and your diaries, and they shut. In all these ways, you have power, you end up in the historical record on your own terms. For people who don't have power, though, the way that they end up in the historical record is as the raw material for other people's entries into history. So I started to think about where were other places that the people I wanted to hear from might have ended up in historical records that kept more in-depth information, more information from their point of view than jail records did. And that's when I hit on social workers. I had been a social worker. My first job when I moved to New York City was working with queer homeless youth in Manhattan. I knew about the copious records that we kept. I knew that many of the people I worked with, even in an institution that at times had to bend to a much more conservative will in the terms of the work we were doing, the people who were doing that work came to it from all kinds of perspective and preserved way more information from the point of view of their clients than would normally have been expected by what our grants required us to do. I knew if I could find files like that there was a chance that I would find information from this perspective of the queer folks who were incarcerated in the House of D. And that's when I hit upon the records of the Women's Prison Association, which is in fact the oldest organization in the country working with formerly incarcerated women. They were formed in the 1800s from another organization called the Police Association of New York. Both organizations are actually still around today. In the 1980s, the Women's Prison Association gave 160 boxes, I believe, mostly of case files from the 30s, 40s, and 50s to the New York Public Library. But when they gave the gift, they made established a clause saying that no one could see any file that was less than 70 years old without explicit permission from the organization. They wanted to protect the information of these people. Totally great, really smart, very happy that they did it. But when they gave the records to the library, they gave the records in alphabetical order, not chronological order. The library, who does permissions on the basis of a box, not on a folder, looked at that and said, well, every box has to have at least one record that's less than 70 years old, and just put everything away under lock and key, so no researchers had ever looked at it. Not once. There was a single researcher, the WPA told me when they gave permission, who had ever asked for permission to see these records. And when they gave me permission, they said, we're happy to have you look at this, but we don't think you're going to find anything. We just do not think we were talking about queer issues in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And I said, this will happen if you are doing research all the time. People will tell you, you will find nothing, I have no information, please don't, and you just have to say, that's great, I totally understand, you are probably right, can I look anyways? And as soon as I did, within the first 2 hours of sitting down with those boxes, I found a file that was hundreds of pages long and followed a queer woman from her first arrest in 1934 up to the end of her life in the 1960s. It was an incredible treasure trove. These contained her letters, both to the social workers, but also to her girlfriends. They contained photos that she had taken showing the way she wanted to present herself. She specifically said, I'm sending you this photo because this is how I want to be seen, right? How often do we get that from formerly incarcerated queer people in the 1930s? It simply was an archive like none I had ever seen before. And that's where the majority of the older part of the book is drawn from. Once I got into the 60s and 70s, there were people who were still alive, who had been involved with the House of Detention, who were able to talk to me, also people who had protested it, also folks who had published their memoirs, like Angela Davis, that cover that time period. So the pre-say 1960 is mostly drawn from these social work files. Post-1960, we have entered into the most homophobic period in American history, and the social work files become much less useful. They tend to now say, in the earlier parts, they would talk and work with queer people very closely, sometimes very negatively, sometimes very positively. In the later years, you tended to find files that said things like, is a lesbian, is not appropriate for services, and they would close the case. Not what you would think, right? You would think the 60s you'd find more information, the 30s you'd find less. Absolutely not the case.
So can we just back up a little? And I should have done a disclaimer and said you have two native New Yorkers up here, so the speed of the conversation is going to be off the charts.
And I'm also super long-winded, so if at any point you're like, he didn't answer that question, like raise your hand and redirect me.
Maybe, but I mean, even just the speed. I was always a court reporter's worst nightmare for that reason. But so thinking about those early files and finding the archives of the Women's Prison Association, the WPA, I'm already curious because your focus is on a jail prison,
Yep.
jail/prison. And yet we're looking to sort of the civil sector, right? The private sector, the helping sector for archives, and you find this trove of information, which to me suggests that these social workers were very involved in
Yes.
the lives of the people in this detention facility. But the book is about the detention facility. So tell me a little bit more about what role did WPA play and how were they even connected to people?
Yeah, the WPA was deeply entangled, both with individuals and with the institution itself. In the earliest year, again, this is the Great Depression when the prison opens up, right? The city paid for no psychological services, no aftercare services. There were only 6 social workers for the entire correctional department in New York. In the 1930s, and they were paid through money made through commissaries inside detention facilities. So if there wasn't enough money made in a particular year, well then you had 5 social workers, right? So there's almost no provision for care. And the WPA swoops in and says, we will fund a psychiatrist, we will fund aftercare services, we will fund, at a very minimal level, these services, and they will use them to then connect people on their way out of prison to the WPA, which has connections to this broader world of social services and charity organizations. The idea was that the social work organization could kind of step in and help bridge the gap, which is often so hard when people leave prison, right? That's one of the hardest moments for folks because you're often abandoned by the state that has been keeping you for so many years, given nothing, and then left on the streets. So the WPA rightfully understood that this was a moment where they could do the most good, though what their idea of good was often would not have been my idea of good. But they understood that this was a place for them to swoop in and to have a role. For many years, they funded those positions. One of the social workers who I follow most closely actually goes from being a social worker at the WPA to being employed by the prison as the head of aftercare services, at which point she does this really wide-reaching survey. She has this whole idea. She understands that what they do is not good, right? She understands that their tendency is to only give services to people who are incarcerated who basically look like them, sound like them, make the right questions, white folks who have a certain amount of privilege and education, who know to ask for the right things, who don't have certain mental health care issues, who don't have physical health issues or drug addiction issues. She understands that that's the way it's working. So she has this idea. She's going to look at the first 200 people who come in under her watch. Half of them she'll do what they normally do, which is just give like a couple of referrals and then dump them. Half of them she's going to do this really intensive social work with. It does not work at all. She is overwhelmed. She gets halfway through the project and before she has to write up the report, and she's like, I couldn't do it. It was impossible. Everything we're doing is wrong. The whole system is wrong. It keeps going just like that. But she is a very useful person for understanding the connection between the two because she was literally studying it and creating the position. So they're connected like that all the way up through World War II. After World War II, the WPA really starts putting their foot down and saying the city needs to fund these services. And the city does start to fund some aftercare services and some social work services. And so the WPA, again, at that moment, starts to back away from these services. Another reason why the files become less and less useful in the 50s and 60s. But that's how they were connected with the institution. The lives of the individuals is a much more complicated picture. Some of these people got out of the prison and wanted nothing to do with the WPA. Their files are a page and a half long. They show up once because they're required to, then maybe 7 months later they show up for dinner once and you never hear from them again. Some of these people came out of prison and found that these social workers were their lifeline, particularly often queer people who were learning about what it meant to be queer. There were certain social workers that they glommed onto. I don't know a lot about those social workers. I can't say anything about their sexual orientations, but certainly in their notes, they were able to talk about these issues in ways that these people obviously had no one else to talk to. So some folks are connected for decades. There are people who I followed who are arrested once, spend one day in the House of Detention, and spend 40 years connected to the Women's Prison Association, which told me that, like you said, this is a surveillance institution, right? They're helping, but they're also keeping track of everyone. And there's a lot of different priorities among the people who are employed there about what it is that they're doing and why they're doing it. But some of them certainly were seen by the formerly incarcerated folks as being helpful. Now, how much of that help came with surveillance and punishment is hard to say, but they certainly would reach out. One of my favorite little stories in the book, there's a woman who is a sex worker who is arrested and incarcerated, and she gets pregnant, has a baby, gives the kid away, tells her social worker in the 1950s, I'm a lesbian, I'm gonna be a lesbian from now on, I am so glad this is all done with. She becomes a stripper, she gets lots of money, she disappears, they don't find her for years and years and years. And then she voluntarily wrote them from Chicago many years later to say, I changed my name, I got an agent, I made it up in the world of stripping, I helped open up a new club, and then I decided to get married to this guy who started showing up. He knew I was a lesbian. He said, I'm a single father who spends all my time at a strip club giving my money to lesbians. Like, who am I to judge you? So they get married, and she changes her name, and she writes to the social worker to tell her this whole story, 12, 15 letters, many pages long, and at the end she says, please stay in touch, just make sure you write Susan on the outside of the envelope, don't call me Max, right? That wouldn't have happened unless there was some connection that was more than just surveillance and punishment. Those kinds of interactions led me to believe that there was something in this archive that was worth it, right? Over and over again, this is the way my process works. The people I'm researching tell me what to listen to, right? That's the most important part. When they say, yes, our stories are being preserved, when they say, this is a story we want to be told, when they say, I'm gonna send this photo because this is how I want to be seen, these are never neutral encounters, right? We always have to know that there is pressure coming from every side. But certainly in terms of every other archive I have ever looked at, there was more of a voice for these people than anywhere else.
Is that sun hitting your face distracting right now? Because we can try to lower the shades if it is.
No.
I don't know. Maybe we can't. Maybe I just offered something that is impossible, but you'll let me know.
Good,
I mean,
good,
it looks lovely, but if it is causing you discomfort, we should probably address it in some way. Okay, so that's the process. That's how you come to this. That's how you approach it. But now let's talk about the House of D.
Yeah.
how are people coming in through the doors? What kinds of offenses? What do we know? We know there are a lot of queer people. We know that that is a focus of the WPA's work and other people's work, right? There's this long-standing sort of conversation around sexuality, gender. Some of it's spoken, some of it's not.
Yep.
But what are the basic offenses that are bringing people in the doors those first, I don't know, 2 decades of the house?
In the first 2 decades, I'm going to answer that question, then we're going to jump back really quickly to the 1870s because I'm a historian and I cannot answer anything without going back to the 19th century. In the first 2 decades, the vast majority of the people who were incarcerated at the House of D were arrested under a specific crime called vagrancy prostitution. You might think this has something to do with sex work. It actually doesn't. In New York state law, vagrancy prostitution in the teens and 20s was defined as the common lewdness of woman. Being a poor woman was a crime called vagrancy prostitution, and the cops could pick you up for it. In fact, in precedent, it's established that there is no need to prove the exchange of sex for money to arrest someone for vagrancy prostitution. The crime lay in the offer of sex, and that someone paying for sex had actually not committed a crime, and that men could not be charged as offering sex under this. It is a law that is specifically written to arrest poor women as prostitutes. And when you are arrested, it was a misdemeanor. So you have no lawyer, you have no jury, there is no need for evidence, and unlike a lot of other misdemeanors at this time, they specifically wrote into the laws that created probation that you were not eligible for probation and that you could be held for up to 3 years with what was called an indeterminate sentence. And an indeterminate sentence that meant that you were held until the jail holding you felt you were reformed enough to be let go, right? So you commit no crime, you have no defense, and you are held for as long as they want to hold you. On top of that, the ones who weren't arrested for vagrancy prostitution were arrested under something called the American Plan. And I shouldn't actually even say arrested, because this is not about arrest. What the American Plan was a World War I military readiness program that was pushed by every attorney general in America. And it established that any woman or girl who was suspected of having syphilis or gonorrhea could be rounded up by the police and held until she was determined to be cured. And this at a time when, unfortunately, they had neither effective tests for gonorrhea and syphilis nor effective cures for gonorrhea and syphilis. In fact, the first cures for gonorrhea and syphilis, the sulfa class of drugs, come about in World War II when they were tested non-consensually on arrested prostitutes at the Women's House of Detention. So in the earliest years, the vast majority of people that are picked up by this system have very little to do with anything that we would ever recognize as quote unquote a crime. And that's largely true, in fact, about the entire criminal legal system up to this day. But it's really obvious when you look back then, right? Because they wrote it all down very bluntly, because they clearly thought that no one was going to look at this. Fingerprinting, for instance, gets tested on women arrested for sex work. And they say part of the reason we're doing this is because there's a lot of them, and if we mess up, well, it doesn't matter all that much. They're just poor women, right? So no one cares. So in the earliest years, that's what we see. And to understand, though, why that's happening, this is where we have to jump back to the 1870s. And I will try to go through this quickly, but without being too fast. 1870s, post-Civil War in America, we get the first freestanding detention institution for women. We also get this big conference for prison reformers in the 1870s in Ohio to decide what prisons are. Now, the reason this is happening is because for the first time ever in America, folks who had largely been controlled by family systems, so all women, white or black, and all black people, male or female, are largely controlled before this point by their birth family, the family that enslaved them, or the families that employed them. They weren't controlled by the criminal legal system in the same way that white men were. So the system we have before the Civil War is largely about punishing the violent antisocial acts of white men. And it really is about punishing, right? This is people who have committed crimes against persons and crimes against property. Maybe you were branded, maybe you had a hand cut off, maybe in the later years in the 1800s you were kept in a penitentiary with this idea of making you penitent through hard labor, but it was no idea about reform or rehabilitation. That's not part of the system. 1870s, we have these new populations entering the public sphere, and that system gets repurposed as a model for social control. So suddenly, a whole host of crimes become important that were never important before. These are crimes against the public order. And the idea, when it came to women, which is written in all of these documents in the 1870s, is that women only have two options for a good legal life. You can be a wife, or you can be a maid. And if you're not one of those two things, you are going to live in poverty and end up a ward of the state and a criminal. So the system they created was a forced feminization program that looked at improperly feminine women, definitely all queer women and non-binary and trans folks, but also largely women of color and lower income women. They were all seen as masculine, mannish of center, and as therefore inappropriate really to be wives or maids ever. And so the system has this idea to arrest more of them at earlier ages with longer sentences, these kind of indefinite sentences without evidence, just because they are the wrong kind of woman or girl. The first wayward minor laws in New York are all written on girls and women. They're not applied to boys until years later. In all of these ways, the system acts to look for women when they can be arrested young and trained. In fact, that first freestanding detention center in the US, in their third annual report, they wrote that their job was to retrain and remold these women so as to make them what God intended, wives, mothers, and the educators of children. The women's justice system in America is doing something very different than the men's system. And that's why when we get to the House of Detention, by the time that's created, they've built this whole legal architecture that exists to incarcerate women and girls for things that are barely crimes, and particularly to focus on queer people who are improperly feminine, because femininity was the heart of employability. Being properly feminine would lead you to be properly employed, and all of these things would keep you from being imprisoned. Which is then why social workers are talking about all of these issues, right? Because they understand that a queer person is more likely to end up incarcerated, and that being incarcerated, in their eyes, is more likely to make you queer. That's why these social workers are talking about the kinds of things that I needed them to be talking about in these records. The whole system is set up from its very inception to focus on queer people and trans people.
With the notion that they can be changed, right? That this is about changing them.
Yes.
And conforming rather than simply removing them from public eye or isolation.
Yeah, it was a mix of the two, right? It's a really eugenic time, so everything is thought to be in your body. Your personality, your sexuality, all of this exists in your body. So some people they felt could not be changed if you were bodily wrong, what was called an invert in the 19th century. We might think of that as intersex or trans today. It's kind of a category that overlaps both those things. They couldn't be fixed. Those you did want to remove from the population. You wanted to make sure they didn't have children. Also, those people who were given these kind of like psychopath diagnoses, incarcerated folks who refused to conform, they would often be sterilized or in other ways removed from having children. This happened largely to women of color in the US, but also to white women who were seen as queer. But most of these people, the intention was to rehabilitate and reform them. The whole idea of rehabilitation really comes out of that 1870s prison conference. We get this idea that we will now have a system that will fix people. You have to arrest them earlier, faster, and more often, of course, so you can get them while they're still fixable. And then, unfortunately, there's a brief period which kind of overlaps with Reconstruction and the Progressive Era, in which we get these kind of prison campuses. They're like reformatories like Bedford Hills. They're large, they're spread out. The people in them, almost always only for women, but they're held in little houses, right, to stimulate this idea of family. The whole idea was about making you a proper woman. So you have a little house together, your group of people keep house, you learn domestic chores, you maybe get help getting a job as a maid. A lot of the folks in the earliest part of the prison do get that kind of help. This whole idea of rehabilitating people comes from this moment in prison reform. But by the time the House of D opens, they have given up on that idea. They are expensive, right? These places are really expensive to run. They don't hold a lot of people. And they're super ineffective because it turns out most of these people weren't in jail because they were improperly feminine. They were in jail because they were poor, and they were queer, and they were black, and there were no jobs for them, and the police targeted them. And those things don't get fixed no matter how much someone teaches you how to keep a house, right? So the system is not fixing the right things. So when they do their statistics at the end of every year, they say, oh, this hasn't worked. We haven't reformed anyone. The problem is trying to rehabilitate people. And then they pass it back on. So by the time the House of D opens, we're no longer interested in rehabilitation, but we've built this architecture that arrests women and trans people at early ages for unserious things with this idea that they were going to get reformed. But we're not doing that anymore. Now we're just warehousing them. And that's what it is for the entirety of the existence of the House of D. One of the folks who runs, we talked about this, Anna Cross. She runs the Department of Corrections in New York in the 50s and 60s. Fascinating figure, totally look her up. One of the things she says at one point is, if I were given an unlimited budget to work in rehabilitation, I would have no idea what to do because we do not know what we are doing. I have no idea what the question was, so I just kept talking.
But you're right to point everyone to Anna Cross as a figure. I mean, she was a magistrate in the Women's Night Court early on, and spoke very critically about what was happening to women that were coming through the court in the earlier part of the century, and then becomes the corrections commissioner and plays a role through all of this history. She is fascinating. I have an article to suggest to you all if you want to read more. But Hugh, when you've been interviewed about the book and when you talk about it, there is this profound interest in sort of the foundation and how it came to be. And then there's this skip forward to Angela Davis being incarcerated and to Stonewall. But there's a period of time that you identify as really critical, which is post-World War II, the 50s, the early 60s, what's happening, and how the racial disproportionality of the people in the House of D shifts a little bit during that time.
Yeah.
So this is your platform to now talk about that time.
Yeah, we'll get to the end part, but in World War II, we have this one moment. World War II is the brief moment where the House of D is not overcrowded for a bunch of different reasons. A lot of women are working in the war effort. They don't want to arrest these women, so the police have kind of backed off. There are actually fewer police in New York because many people are serving, so there isn't the ability to police at the same levels. There aren't the levels of infrastructure to incarcerate folks, so a lot of people are let out earlier or faster. For all of these reasons, the House of D is briefly under full in that period. But masked by all of this, and by the fact that during the Great Depression, the city of New York did not put out any documentation of any kind. So there are no annual reports for the courts, no annual reports for the prisons. There's almost nothing you can find. Sometime between 1933 and 1942, a vast flip happens in the population that's detained. We go from mostly detaining white women to mostly detaining black women. This doesn't happen in men's jails until the late 60s, early 70s. So something really significant is changing here, and it's changing first among incarcerated women. And in that period, after we get out of World War II, when the numbers start to skyrocket back up again, we get the beginnings of our drug war. In fact, we get, honestly, sort of the beginnings of both the drug war and the war on terrorism, though at that moment it's a war on communists, which is also largely a war on queer people. That's all happening in the 1950s, the most homophobic decade in American history. We kind of turn our eyes away from the prison. We get these new laws coming in. Almost all drugs used to be handled the way we handle cigarettes today, which is to say a regulatory regime. You can buy it as much as you want, but you're going to pay this extra tax because we don't want you to smoke them. Heroin used to be handled that way. Cocaine used to be in Coca-Cola. You could get edibles for menstrual cramps from your local pharmacist. All of these things that were entirely legal for many of the people in the prison in the 40s and 50s are suddenly made illegal, largely due to the racist manipulation of this guy named Harry Ansbacher, who is a nightmare.
And what a sinister name, too.
Ansbacher.
Yeah.
It's very frightening in German.
Good.
But this is the moment where these laws are all really put in place. And so this is where we start to see the transition away from just arrests for sex work, though those continue, and into arrests of political prisoners and huge numbers of arrests of people on drug charges. And in fact, although a lot of people are now also not arrested on drug charges, they're incarcerated for drug charges. By the end of the 60s, they'll start estimating that 70, 80% of the people incarcerated are deeply addicted. And they may not have been arrested for their addiction, but that's largely why they were put into the jail, or the arrest was in some way related to their addiction. All of that starts here in this moment. And for a lot of the people being arrested, what they had been doing 10 years earlier was legal, right? The laws got built around them. We created an entire class of drug criminals that did not exist before. And then, because we criminalized them and made it impossible for them to get heroin or cocaine or weed legally, well, now we need to create whole supply chains to get illegal drugs to them. And so what happens here in this moment in the 1950s creates the global drug trade as we know it today, outlaws millions of people, and drives up these arrest rates, which eventually is going to lead directly into the 1970s and our era of mass incarceration. But it starts here in the 40s and 50s. And at the same time, we also start arresting all of these communists, right? The Red Scare, people like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Ethel Rosenberg, they both passed through the House of D. Tons and tons of folks who were in the communist or socialist parties, Claudia Jones, Betty Gannett, all of them passed through the House of D during this time period. And we start to set up an architecture for arresting people on these really specious crimes. The Smith Act arrests, which is like doing anything that, what is it, not mandates the overthrow of the government, but promotes, suggests. Yeah. So they're arresting these women for being involved with the Communist Party of the USA, even though the CPUSA at that time has in their bylaws that they do not push for the violent overthrow of the US government. Just being in the Communist Party, right? That famous, are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? That's targeting political prisoners. But the most common arrest during the Red Scare was actually of a gay man who had been arrested for soliciting. They were remarkably bad at finding communists. They were remarkably good at finding gay people in the government. And they were largely sacrificed by the State Department because they needed scapegoats. They were trying to protect, right? The whole communist red and lavender scare are the Republicans attempting to gain power because the social programs of the 1930s, the New Deal, right, was so popular that they were really going to be locked out of federal power. So they have to demonize the federal administrative state. And the best way to do that was to bring up these like bogeymen of communists and homosexuals, because anyone can be a communist and anyone can be a homosexual. You can accuse anyone of anything you want and you don't have to prove a goddamn thing. All of this is operating in the 1950s, and it'll get forgotten about, right? It gets buried and masked and remade into new laws and switched and changed, sort of the way Nixon recreates his Southern strategy. But that's the operative threads that lead us right into our current era of mass incarceration.
But also during that time, as you describe in the book, there's some organizing that's happening at the House of D, and there's something going on. Right, there's, I guess, another shift. And so I would love to spend just a little bit of time talking about what it was actually like, the relationships, the organizing, the coalitions, the sort of the way this all felt and occurred after this was built.
Yeah, by the 1950s, the House of D is a queer landmark. I can find women in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s saying, we would hang out at the pharmacy across the street because there was a soda fountain and a payphone. And you could watch people coming in and out, and you could wait for the women that you'd been arrested with 6 months ago, and you could see them, and you could get in touch with people, and people would go there to hang out. It's becoming an organizing center, and the folks who are incarcerated are starting to realize that they themselves have a measure of power by being in Greenwich Village, right? The first riot in the House of D is in 1954, and throughout the 50s, they riot over and over again. They set fire to their belongings, and they throw them out the windows at passers-by. They scream about the food and about the violence against the guards because they know they can reach people, and they start to organize with one another. These are the moments where we get organizations like the Daughters of Bilitis and the Mattachine Society, but we're also starting to see so much of the civil rights movement and the early Black Power movement, and these women are involved with all of these organizations, tangentially, minorly, here and there, but increasingly. And because it's in the village where a lot of these queer organizations are getting started, they find out about them, they hear about them. At one point, there's this woman who I read about in the book who is, she's a cabaret singer, but she's also an early computer operator. If you've seen Hidden Figures, you know the work that they do. She's one of those women. She's from an upper middle class black neighborhood in Queens. Her family's really supportive. She has a butch white girlfriend named Rocky, who is the foreman at a toy factory. The two of them kind of are this lesbian butch femme power couple. She cuts an album at one point. She's been out as a lesbian since she was 12. Everyone is afraid of her at the Women's Prison Association. They do not want to annoy her. She's beautiful, she's cultured, she has conservatory training. The notes about her are fantastic because they're constantly like, we didn't want to say anything that would upset her, you know? It's funny when you see those things in these social work notes. But she says at one point, she mostly dates women, then for a little while she tries to date some men. They're really pushing her to date men. She tries it, but she's like, it's just not for me. But she says, she comes in one day and she says, you know, I saw this flyer about a homosexual lecture, and I'm gonna go. It's like 1957. And it's that lecture is the start of the Mattachine Society's yearly conference, and it's where the New York chapter of the Daughters of Belita, so the earliest lesbian organizations in the country, gets founded. And she gets involved. And after that, she disappears from the social work notes, right? She stops coming. She gets involved with these organizations. And that happened because the prison was in Greenwich Village, where these queer organizations were flyering, right? In every way, the prison is kind of at the center for queer women and trans people arrested all around the city and brought here, but also for the burgeoning queer community that was already there, but is growing bigger and bigger and bigger because of the prison. Because in the 1950s, the police could raid any bar. They could arrest you for wearing pants on the street. They could break into your house and arrest you for the kind of sex you were having until Bowers v. Hardwick, right? But they could not stop the prison because they were the ones bringing queer people there. So as they are shutting down everything else, the House of Detention is unique. It becomes a major rallying point, and it will remain that way until it is closed in 1971. It is fundamental to understanding the development of Greenwich Village or the development of queer community and politics in America, though it has been largely erased from all of those stories. This is the moment. It may have been happening before and just poorly recorded, right? But in the 50s is really when you start to see these incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people working together. They're working inside the prison to have these riots. They're working outside the prison to get involved with organizations for their rights. They're forming organizations, social organizations, not established ones, right? But these kind of informal ones that connect them to each other. All of that will lay the groundwork for the revolutionary actions of the 1960s and 70s.
What a gift. I feel a little obligated to then take us through the 60s and 70s, but I do, so we can do that, and we have to talk about the Panther 21 and sort of others that came through the doors and what that looked like, I guess. Let's talk about it.
Sure.
Talk about it.
Yeah.
What happened then after that period of time, as the political landscape outside is shifting and we move into the 60s and later 60s and 70s?
In 1965, we get a really big and important arrest of an 18-year-old girl who was protesting the Vietnam War outside the UN. She was arrested on a Friday night. She was a college activist from Bennington College, a white woman from the suburbs. She was arrested on Friday night, incarcerated for 3 days. During her intake, like all people who are arrested, she was given a forced enema and a brutal cavity search. They knew, actually, at the House of Detention that no contraband had literally ever been found in a single one of these searches, and they did them for decades. They were protested from the moment the prison opened till the moment the prison closed. Nothing changed. When they did this on her, however, she was brutally scarred internally. She bled for days. And when she was finally released, they wouldn't let her contact a lawyer or anything. None of the women arrested from the peace protest. For 3 days, they were held there. One of them was sexually assaulted by 2 women, and none of this got handled. When she finally got out, her parents didn't want her to talk about what had happened to her there. One of the other women at the protest had taken some extra clothes of hers, so she went to go find that woman who lived in Greenwich Village, and that woman turned out to be Grace Paley, the author and activist. And she said to this young girl, "If you want, we are going to tell your story to the world." And she said yes, and that story would end up taking down the House of D. That woman was Andrea Dworkin, the 1970s feminist. This is long before she becomes kind of the heart of the sex and porn wars as we know her. She is just starting her journey as a radical feminist. And she goes on TV shows, newspapers, she writes in everywhere. Because of her, 5 different investigations into the House of D were started that year. And largely because of that, the prison was eventually closed and moved to Rikers. She, many, many years later, would say that when she started to write about pornography, she didn't want to write about pornography. She wanted to write about what was happening to women in prisons, but no one would publish her about that. And so instead she wrote about pornography because she felt she could cover the same issues. I don't think that's actually true, but she felt that way. So that's 1965. But the really big, for queer history purposes, the really big moment is actually 1969. Some of you may have heard of the Stonewall Riots, kind of a foundational moment in queer history that happens in Greenwich Village in June of 1969. What I didn't know when I started doing this research is that the bar, Stonewall Inn, was 500 feet from the House of Detention. The people on the inside could see the bar, they could hear it, they could smell it. They would always tell me about how they could smell the pastry shops wafting up, but on the night of the Stonewall Riots, as things were being destroyed and set on fire, they could smell the riots that were happening. They knew what was going on, and they held a riot all their own. This woman named Arcus Flynn gave an oral history about how she was driving home on that first night of Stonewall through the West Village. She worked as a night nurse. And as she was passing Washington Square, she started to notice these weird little lights in the sky. She couldn't tell what they were. So she got closer and she got out of her car and she parked and she realized they were fires. And so she was drawn to them and she walked up and she realized it was the women inside setting fire to their belongings and throwing them out to the rioters below, chanting, "Gay rights, gay rights, gay rights." Women have been trying to tell this side of the story of Stonewall for decades, and it gets left out entirely. When the New York Times in 2016 wrote about the efforts to landmark Stonewall, they said the riot was all gay men, and grudgingly issued a correction in which they stated there was at least one lesbian involved. One! That was all they would give you. Jay Toole was actually there, so if anyone had talked to her, they would have known a little bit more about this. But in that moment, the prison becomes a flashpoint for the emerging queer liberation movement, because after Stonewall, a meeting gets held. The older activists, the Mattachine Society, the Daughters of Bleedus, they want to take this new energy and they want to channel it in appropriate ways, but they don't want to piss off the police and the city government, because they've actually been working very closely with the mayor's office in an effort to stop the raids on gay bars. In fact, the reason the Stonewall Inn gets raided is because the officer who raids it refused to take the mob bribes not to raid it. He didn't raid it because it was a gay bar. He was going after the mob because these older organizations had been working with the city, ineffectually in some ways, certainly, but they felt that they were getting somewhere. So they wanted to channel these young Stonewall activists away from protesting the police, away from protesting the prison. And when they said, "We want to protest the prison in support of the Black Panthers who are incarcerated there," the older activists said no. And those younger activists, the Stonewall vets, they left the meeting and announced a new organization called the Gay Liberation Front. One of the most significant queer organizations to come out of the 1960s, 70s, was launched specifically to protest the Women's House of Detention in support of the Black Panthers. And who were those Black Panthers? Well, as you mentioned, it was a case called the Panther 21, which was an attempt to really destroy the Black Panther Party in New York. All of these leaders were simultaneously arrested with this idea. The cops said that they had had all this dynamite, and the next morning after they were arrested, they were planning to blow up all of these places. Police stations, Bloomingdale's, the Botanical Gardens, all of these places. So they arrest all of these leaders. They never found any dynamite. They never, in fact, found any weapons. They found like 3 knives, 2 sawed-off shotguns, and a pistol among all of these arrests. And every single one of the folks arrested was facing over 300 years in jail. 2 of them were women, Afeni Shakur and Joan Bird. Both of them were held in the House of Detention, and they were there during the Stonewall Riots. Afeni Shakur would later say that watching out the window and seeing gay protesters helped her to think about the connections between gay rights and Black power. And when she got out of prison, she actually worked very closely with Huey P. Newton, with the Gay Liberation Front, to connect these movements. She invited all of these Gay Liberation Front members to a meeting with Huey P. Newton at Jane Fonda's apartment. You can actually see video of that on YouTube if you want to. It's an incredible moment. She worked to get all of these queer organizations to the Black Panthers Revolutionary People's Convention to rewrite the American Constitution, where they had both a queer men and queer women's workshop. She did a ton. She didn't unfortunately talk about the other part of her queer life in the prison, which is that she met her girlfriend there. I was lucky enough to be able to interview her girlfriend, who is also a prison activist, who has a lot to do with Bedford Hills and prisoners' rights litigation in the 1970s. And she told me about how much Afeni, who, for those of you who don't know, Afeni Shakur's son is Tupac Shakur. And Carol Crooks, the woman who actually spoke to who's in the book, is listed as his father on his birth certificate. Tupac's original birth name is Leslane Parrish Crooks, right? This is how closely connected all of these movements are and these people are. We don't ever talk about this, right? Nobody ever talks about Afeni Shakur's time as a queer liberation icon, but she was central, right? These organizations were knit together through the Women's House of Detention, where also they were knit together with the Young Lords and the Red Stockings and the Youth Against War and Fascism. Everyone protested this prison. In 1969, at the end of the year, from Christmas to New Year's, there was a 24/7 permanent encampment of people protesting the prison, much like Occupy Wall Street, where people exchanged information, tactics, techniques. They met each other. The prison was central yet again. It had been central to lesbian and trans communities for many years. Now it became central to activist communities, all through these Black Panthers and these Gay Liberation Front members. And how often, I mean, growing up, I don't know about all of you, but when I was growing up, I was certainly told that 1970s gays were racist, and that the Black Panthers were homophobic, and that there was certainly never going to be any connection between those two, let alone Black leaders in the queer liberation movement and gay leaders in the Black Panthers. But so many folks involved with both of those movements fit under both umbrellas. It's just so rare that we actually knit these stories together, because by 1974, the prison is gone. And today, when I started doing research for this book, I could find very vanishingly few queer women and trans folks who had been incarcerated in the prison who were still alive. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, nothing to do with that, but today, only one of them is still alive. Every single other person that I spoke to died of COVID. That's how this history has gotten so effectively erased. They destroyed the buildings and they destroyed the people, right? But these histories are knit together through the House of D.
Open it up for questions in a few seconds. I just have a little bit more. And one of the things that, so the book obviously focuses on sort of the criminalization and the policing of queerness, right? And you have stats about how many people end up incarcerated who are LGBTQ, but then there's something else that happens also in relationships inside the House of D that you describe, and people don't fit neatly into any categories. I think you say 40% of the people incarcerated there identified as queer from their experiences before coming in. But there's a whole other story told about their experiences while incarcerated and the relationships. And you notice that this is different from relationships that grow inside facilities designated for men. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so by the 60s, obviously the jail is not keeping any stats on queer people, but there is a woman who was incarcerated there, Virginia McManus, she's a real big celebrity, arrested for sex work. She's a Brooklyn substitute teacher. She writes a memoir about it, and she had psychologist training, and she estimates about 75% of the people in the House of D were queer in some way, which is about the same as a prison psychologist a few years later, in like 1969. She estimates something like 70% of folks are involved with what she calls the play family. She sees these relationships as attempts to figure out how to be heterosexual, because they are trapped. They have no proper outlets. So, people who are incarcerated for 24 hours, what are they going to do? They have to turn lesbian. It's a very weird idea that they have. But inside the women's prisons, right, what everyone says is basically that it was impossible to separate out queer people from not queer people. They try occasionally. They'll make them wear D's on their uniforms for degenerate, but that was mainly just for people who we would today recognize as trans or butch or masculine of center studs. So it was just a very minor number of people, and that was inconsistent. Sometimes they did it, sometimes they didn't. In men's prisons in this time, even dating back really truly until the 1920s and 30s in New York, we have what are variously called the fairy wings, or Today, I think the one in Rikers now is the Trans-Inclusive Housing Unit, I think is what they call it now. These are places where usually effeminate queer men, trans women, and certain men who are arrested for particular gay crimes, soliciting, get placed partially for their own protection, partially as segregation. They're really complicated spaces. If you talk to the people who've been incarcerated in them, they have both good and bad things to say about them, but it's a very different way of handling it. So in that moment that I was talking about earlier, after Fini Shakur gets out of prison, she actually lives for a while in this apartment in the West Village that's owned by this really rich woman who wants to support the Black Panthers and gay liberation. So she establishes as a crash pad for all of these activists to come through. So Fini Shakur is living there at the same time with Joan Bird, Joan Bird's girlfriend, and these two guys who were involved with the Gay Liberation Front. And they become like a little family for a little while. So one of these guys, Giles, I've talked to him many times, and he says, when I was there, I was helping to raise Tupac and taking care of him and changing his diapers and things like that. And Lumumba Shakur shows up at one point, and he gets really upset at Afeni for letting this gay man take care of his male child. And Afeni Shakur told him to fuck off. She was like, he's helping me, you haven't certainly been around, and if you want to have a talk about this, we can talk about it, but I'm not going to stop him from helping. And they actually have this really great conversation. They end up sitting down, and he says to Giles, I just don't see any way that you can have solidarity between straight and gay prisoners in men's prisons, because here's the system in a men's prison. You've got that ferry wing, right? So those people are protected by the guards, who are the ultimate enemy, right? So already they're segregated out, and they're different. They're already sort of tainted in a certain way. They're effeminate, which is the absolute worst thing you can be in a men's prison. And there's a huge number of other people having gay sex in the prison, but they're rapists, right? He talks about what he calls asshole bandits, and how they will try to rape you, and the only thing you can do is kill the man who attempts to do that. And the guards will let you do that, because that's an appropriate thing for you to do. So the men's prison system sets up this idea of sexuality, which is this. There are effeminate men who are collaborators with the government and are weak. And then there are lying, rapist, asshole bandits. And the only thing for you to do, if you don't want to end up in either group, is kill anyone who hits on you, right? That's what the men's prison says. The women's prison, everyone is mixed together. 75% of the people are queer, or at least willing to explore these ideas. There's solidarity growing between the different movements of activists, because they're all there for the same reason, and none of them are viewed as collaborators. There's a real difference in the way in which being incarcerated in a women's facility and being incarcerated in a men's facility taught you about sexuality, though it taught both sides, right? So when we talk about this kind of like machismo, either in the Young Lords or in the Black Panthers, when we talk about these kinds of homophobia, we have to understand that these are state-sponsored, state-instructed. After you had been arrested, the government told you what to think about homosexuals and permitted you to kill them if you were in men's institutions, right? And that's not what we see in women's institutions, which is maybe why so many Black Panther female leaders were open to talking about their own sexuality. I've talked to Erica Huggins. You read Angela Davis. If you talk to, or look at Afeni Shakur, Carol Crooks, all of these people who were women in leadership in the Black Panthers had these really in-depth relationships with queer people, partially through prisons, but partially through other things. And that did not happen for men who were leaders in the Black Panthers. And I think we have to consider that when we talk about how these institutions developed. Also, separate but small minor note that I think is really worth talking about. This same moment, right after this, the 60s, 70s, into the 80s moment, this is when the first houses, as we think about in ballroom and voguing today, the House of LaBeija, gets established. Voguing comes out of the Rikers Island Ferry Wing, where it's an art form that's used to compete and to fight. In that moment, as those families are being formed in men's institutions, women's institutions are full of these things called the play family, right? You have all of these women who are siblings, cousins, twins, this whole network. To a degree, the same process that is happening for queer people, being isolated from your families and abandoned by the state, that makes you create these kind of chosen families, is also happening for incarcerated people. And it's certainly happening for queer incarcerated people, right? These systems of families through ballroom, or if you watch the L Word, Mississippi, they talk a little bit about these other kinds of queer black family structures. Really great documentary, highly recommend it, it's a little depressing. But I think that we have to look at the ways in which incarceration and what happens to you inside of prison affects your life outside of prison. I think many of these things have been divorced. We want, or have been told to imagine, that what happens in prison has nothing to do with the rest of the world. And certainly we try to push prisons and formerly incarcerated people as far away, ban them from living certain places, move the prisons to islands or to the border of the state, make sure that no one can send letters, get photos. In all these ways, we're trying to isolate the idea of the prison from what happens outside. But I think it makes what happens outside incomprehensible to us when we do that.
I'm going to ask folks to raise their hands if they have questions. We're going to take a few questions.
Oh, and I will say, I'm very easy to find on the internet. So if you have questions you don't feel comfortable asking here, or it occurs to you later, like, you can totally ask me another time. I love questions.
Do we have a mic? Is there some? Yes. So Justine, maybe Emmy up here, and then Professor Simonson. As Justine is walking there, I mean, so much of what you cover in the book, it's just all cyclical. It repeats itself over and over and over again. It's the conversations we're having now and what we're talking about now in terms of Rikers Island, and is there such a thing as a feminist jail? I don't know, Hugh. You make an interesting case here. I think your work could be taken in a lot of different ways, and I'm not so sure.
I mean, before we get to the questions, one real, because I can't leave that one standing. Sorry, I just got to jump in. But really quickly, that cyclical nature, yes. Doing this research showed me that in liberal and conservative moments, the prison system is exactly the same. It is unchangeable. Most reforms do not understand what the system does, so they are unable to actually do anything because the system is neither about justice nor rehabilitation. It is merely a super efficient, monstrous drain that lets all of our other broken systems remain broken by taking the people who we do not care for and hiding them as effectively as we can. There is no such thing as a feminist jail. There is no way in which you can make prisons and jails do anything other than what it is they are intended to do, which is literally to trap and hide people. That is the nature of the system. And the reason it is cyclical is because when we do get attention, reformist attention focused on prisons and jails, they focus on the wrong things, and they tend to expand the jail, make it bigger, give you more money for services, but that just ends up making more cages and more prisons, right? So, yeah, okay, now we can go on to questions. Just had to jump in.
So thank you so much for being here, first of all. So glad I'm here today. I wanted to ask, when hearing you talk about the law as a mechanism for queer cleansing throughout history, I can't help but think about what's happening to trans people in the law now. And I wonder, to what extent do you see a thread there? And also, from what you've learned and what you've written about, what can we take away as possible solutions, or how we confront what's happening to trans people now?
That is a great question. One thing I will say is that I am a historian, and that there are people working on these issues today who know so much more than I do in terms of the answers. I'm certain many of them are in this room. I can give some thoughts, but like, I am not the expert on the abolition movement of today, and to preface. But I see those parallels. They are deep and they are disturbing. One in particular that I think is really operative right now is this idea of appealing to protecting childhood. White childhood, really, proper femininity, youth. All of these laws were constructed with this idea of, okay, we're going to arrest people really young, so we'll fix them, we'll get them, we'll put them in the right direction. And when I hear all of these people talking about, oh, you're too young to know, too young to get appropriate gender transition services, you're too young, and then they start pushing that line, you're too young at 13, no, you're too young at 18, now you're too young at 25, right? This idea of the child, the imaginary child that has nothing to do with actual children that we do not fund or give care to, this idea of the child is always used against queer folks over and over and over again. And I think we see that happening right now with groomer panics. I think we see that happening right now with trans youth services panics. We see it happening with book bans that all talk as a starting point about children, but then they use that point to then go really, really far afield because it isn't actually about children, right? It's never about children. They are simply an easy wedge issue to make a much bigger case around. I think a lot of what is happening right now about trans people to trans people in the eyes of conservative America is simply like trying to roll back everything that we have done and then extend it to make these kind of like bigger bans, put laws into place that will actually stop what had previously been hard to do but not governed by a law necessarily, you know? Now they're trying to put laws in place to govern it. So yes, I do see these absolute connections. In terms of what we can do, every day I wake up to that question, right? There's a lot though. I often, it's like they say, abolition is a daily practice and so is hope. We've got to go into this every day saying, make the changes you can make, fight the fights that you can fight. I think there is a lot of room, whether that is, today you're able to give money, whether that's tomorrow you're able to read a book about abolition that you couldn't handle yesterday, and then Thursday you're gonna write a letter to a trans prisoner, and then Friday you're gonna attend a local city council meeting where they are debating some of these issues. Like, find the steps that you can take, because all of these things, like I think some people think that abolition is like about going to a jail and protesting outside of it, and that's a huge part. Yes, I highly recommend everybody do that, but there is so much more to this that we can bring into our daily lives, and then we can move it away from specifically talking about laws and then to start thinking about justice. I mean, what does it mean to have an abolitionist perspective on how you handle interpersonal conflicts or organizational conflicts, right? I think there are many ways that we can start to undo some of this work. But it starts with showing up, which thank you everyone also for showing up tonight, like on a Monday night in the middle of the rain during like multiple pandemics. That's a lot, you know.
This counts for Monday, right?
Oh God, it's Tuesday.
No, Monday, check. You got,
Oh,
you showed up today.
Yes.
You showed up today.
Yes, no.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I mean that's kind of how I try to think about it. I don't know if that answered your question though.
I think Professor Simonson had a question also. Oh, wait, we have one ready to go, and then we'll get to Professor Simonson. Sorry, I'm going to confuse everyone by pointing in different directions at the same time.
So in your book, you deal with a lot of historical context going up until the 70s.
Can you hold the mic a little closer so we can, yeah, thank you.
In your book, you deal with a lot of history going up to the 70s, and however, during the 1980s, and this might be outside your scope since you deal more with history, but I was wondering, do you have any opinion, or perhaps has there been any role that the private industry or the private prison industrial complex has had on specifically queer women?
That's an interesting question. I don't know, honestly, because that is where my work largely ends. I will say that I have yet to see an issue in which private prison investment has made things better. So I'm just going to take a guess that it's made things worse. But it's specific for queer folks, not that I know of. I do know that private prisons are much harder to get information out of. They're much harder to get information into. They are, they're extracting money off of something that absolutely it is soulless to do. So yeah, I don't know specifically, unfortunately, though, about how they affect queer folks. Does anyone in the room? There's a good chance someone here might. Okay, well, if someone does and they think of it later, raise your hand.
I think I would certainly support the notion that they have not made anything better. Professor Simonson.
Hi, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming. So, hearing you talk now about abolition and about this, multi-year, a decade of learning that you've done to bring us this book, there are some moments toward the end where you talk about how you have personally been transformed through the research, through the writing, through meeting everybody, into someone, as I gather, who doesn't think jails can be feminist or thinks maybe they shouldn't exist and maybe didn't start that way. And so I'm curious about that transformation, which I think we can see and imagine just from hearing you talk today. But I'm thinking it especially in the context of sitting in a law school. There are lots of people here today, but a lot of people sitting here are law students. A lot of them are in my criminal law class. They're first-year law students. And we're coming into law school to learn about law and what it does and how it functions. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about your personal transformation, but also just sort of how any of us can be open to being transformed through what we learn, or how to be open to changing what we think the law is, can be, should be.
That's a good question, because I do think, I will say, I think that kind of personal change is essential because we need so many more people, right? Everyone has to be involved. For me, I was, a pretty progressive Democrat. I think if you had asked me before I started doing this work, I would definitely have said, oh, prisons are bad. They're broken. I would have definitely used the word broken, which now I would never. But that's what I thought, right? Because I had this idea that we're all taught that prisons are about justice and rehabilitation. You do the crime, do the time, then, la la la, everything's great. And none of that is true. But we think that. And so when we see that not happening, we think, oh, something is broken. We'll fix it. We'll noodle around the edges on the way justice is happening because this is about justice. The more I dug into this research, the more I saw exactly what we're saying about this cyclical nature, that things just did not get better, right? And more than that, no one seemed to think they were going to, right? The administration of the prison certainly saw all the problems from the very beginning and were like, most of the people who are here should never have been arrested and will not be helped by being here. In fact, will be made worse by being here. The folks who had been arrested certainly agreed with that prescription. The social workers agreed with it. The newspapers agreed with it. The mayor agreed with it. And that was in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, 70s. It was endless, right? So if that can't make any change, if everyone says the system is not working and we need to change it, and that doesn't do anything, then you don't have a broken system, right? You have a system that's doing something that we do not understand, and it's doing it at a fundamental level that is required by the rest of our systems, right? That's the reason prisons go right back to what they were, because every other system that we have requires them to be that way. If we did not have prisons as we have them today, then we'd have to do something about our fucking welfare system, right? We'd have to do something about the homelessness crisis. We'd have to do something about healthcare crises, about the drug crisis, right? But prisons allow us to imagine that those other systems are functioning, because prisons are where you shove everyone that you don't want to care for, right? And once I started to see that, once I started to see that everybody agreed they weren't working and nobody could change it, and that none of the reforms led to anything other than making the system bigger, I asked myself, who has this analysis, right? Who out there is saying this exact thing that I'm seeing? Because certainly I am not the first one to see this, right? And that instantly led me to abolition. They were the only people who seemed to grasp what the system was and what it was doing. And of course, Angela Davis, having been incarcerated in the House of D, she was an easy place for me to start. I needed to research her anyways, start with her autobiography, work my way through everything else she read. But that brought me to more modern thinkers, Mariam Kaba, Andrea Ritchie, Joey Magel, all of these folks who are working today, scholars, activists, community organizers, and their analysis made sense. They were the only people who seemed to know what was actually happening in these prisons. So of course I had to listen to them. And listening to them started off with unlearning this idea that prisons are broken, or that they have anything to do with justice, or rehabilitation, or preventing violence, right? This comes up sometimes in Q&As. People will say to me, I agree with this idea, but what do we do about violent criminals, right? And I always want to tell them, let's step back. What's your concern here? Your concern is that someone will commit another violent crime, right? That someone will get hurt because this person wasn't put in prison. Well, what we know about prisons is that that person's going to get hurt by being put in there. And that the community they come from is going to be hurt, and their family's going to be hurt, and their friends are going to be hurt. It's going to extract a huge amount of money to keep them in that prison. And while they're there, every year 200,000 people are sexually violated in US jails. Every year. And those are just the people who report it, right? So violence is going to happen to those people. When we ask, what about violent criminals? What we're really saying is, what about people who deserve violence? Because that's what prison is. It's a violent place that we put people that we think deserve the violence that we don't think we deserve. And that's what brought me to really and truly say, abolition is the only way forward, because we will never fix these other systems so long as we have the prison system to hide everything. And that's where, as depressing as my entire book and this whole talk is, I apologize, but that's where I started to find some hope, because I've been so involved with queer politics for so long, right? And here was something that seemed so operative and fundamental to me. Abolition brought me away from questions of legal versus illegal, and to questions of harm versus care. Who is harmed by our systems, and who is cared for by our systems, and where is the state putting its thumb on the scale? Well, when you think about queer politics, right? Queer politics are all about care and bodily autonomy, right? That's what they should be. This is my problem with marriage politics, right? Is that it's an attempt to take the thin, narrow piece of care that our government institutionalizes and gives to married people and extending it to a slightly broader number of people who happen to be gay. But what I really want is to fund systems of care generally, because when we have, what we have in America is are vertical identities, right? You are the same race as your children, or the religion as your children, or that you come from the same place. These vertical identities are ones we think matter. Horizontal identities, like queerness, which sort of pop up here and there and there and there, we don't think those matter. And so long as our government believes that care should come from the nuclear family, which is a vertical identity, there will always be queer people who will not be cared for in the exact same way. And often the exact same people who end up in prison, right? They are not cared for. Care is an operative word that I think we can form a politics around that is fundamentally abolitionist and fundamentally queer. What do children abandoned by their parents need? Care. What do queer seniors with no descendants to take care of them need? Care. What did the AIDS crisis show our government's lack of? Care. What is the right to appropriate gender transition services? Care. Over and over again, the queer movement comes down to care and bodily autonomy, which is the same heart as the movement for abolition. And for me, that's a way we can move this forward, right? That began to give me some hope, because I saw that there was this movement for queer rights already, and there is an abolition movement already, and this maybe could be a spot where I could work, right? I could knit these things together through history, the thing that I love to do, because I am just a big nerd at heart, and all I really want is to sit in the archives. So that's how I kind of came to the place I'm at now. But it was a journey of reading this stuff over and over again. And it didn't emerge from any specific story. So in the book, the whole introduction is about abolition, because you could read the book, like you were saying, and never come to that conclusion on your own. I wanted to give the lens that I had seen from the 10 years of research to the readers of the book. So then they may come to different conclusions, but at least they read it and they see the conclusion that I've come to, and they can evaluate the steps that got me there along the way as they read.
If you can just give me 1 second, we're going to give people an opportunity now to go upstairs and enjoy each other's company at the reception. But before we do that, I know when I say reception, everyone starts to move towards the wine and food. But Hugh, thank you. When you talk about knitting together all of these things, the book does this. I mean, there's so much we didn't even get to talk about tonight. How can people buy it?
It's everywhere.
Thank you.
It's on that website that I will not name, cheaper than most places, but it's also in all of your local bookstores. There's an ebook version, there's an audio version. It's totally out there. I don't read the audio version.
It would take 30 seconds. You wouldn't hear a thing. It would just be a blur.
I read the audio of my first book, and I love reading audio, but we thought that it would be too strange in certain places to have me reading it, and I think that that was the right choice. That we did some focus testing, and there were people who just said, it would be hard for me to hear this from a man's voice. And I was like, yep, I want the most readers. I can back away from that.
Our library has the audio version online and copies of the book as well, but buy it. Folks, buy it. Support Hugh.
And thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight.